I'm Victoria Dangle. I'm the Executive Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, and I'm delighted to welcome both our in-person and online audience to tonight's lecture, which is part of the Labor, Literature, and Landmark Lecture Series. We are pleased to present tonight's talk in partnership with the Historic Districts Council. I also want to mention that this lecture is also a part of October, and I mention as well that the book Old Buildings, New Ideas by our distinguished speaker, Françoise Bollack, on which tonight's talk is based, will be available to be purchased. And for those of you less familiar with the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, a brief introduction. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen was founded in 1785 by the skilled craftsmen of New York City. Today, our organization continues to serve and improve the quality of life of the people of the city of New York through its educational, cultural, and philanthropic programs, which include our Mechanics Institute, the General Society Library, and the John M. Mossman Locke Collection, and our 200-year-old lecture series, of which this lecture is a part of. And to introduce our speaker for this evening, I'm very pleased to introduce to you Frampton Tolbert, who is the Executive Director for the Historic Districts Council. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I'm Frampton Tolbert, the Executive Director of the Historic Districts Council, and we are so thrilled to be partnering tonight with the General Society on this program. For those of you who don't know HDC, we are the citywide advocate for New York's historic neighborhoods, and we work with more than 500 community-based organizations to help preserve their cultural, architectural, and historical places that matter to them. We hold lots of programs and do advocacy across the city on many campaigns. So we invite you to, we do programs like this and look forward to partnering with the General Society in the future. We invite you to visit hdc.org to learn more about us. With that, I'd like to introduce our speaker this evening. Françoise Bollack is an architect, architectural historian, and an educator. She is a practicing architect and the founder of Françoise Bollack Architects, whose practice focuses on the design opportunities of working with existing buildings. Ms. Bollack is also an adjunct associate professor of historic preservation in the Historic Preservation Program at the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University. In addition, she is on the board of directors of the Historic Districts Council, and I should say a past president, and also on the board of the City Club of New York and the chair of its Preservation Committee. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Françoise.
Thank you very much. And thank you to all of you who are here tonight. And thank you to the people who are with us online. It's always great to be in this building. It's a really great building. It's always great to be in this room with the smell of books. I hope you all inhale the smell of these books. I want to thank Victoria Dangle and the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen, and also the Historic Districts Council for sponsoring this talk. Now, what is this about? Old Buildings, I'm going to put on my glasses. Old Buildings, New Ideas, a selective architectural history of additions, adaptations, reuse, and design inventions. So this is really about a different way to see history, because typically histories of architecture talk about the new. They focus on new buildings, new forms, designed by architects who become, you know, the standard bearer for a certain style. So it's a sort of march force towards the present, and it's really all about the new. This is not what this book is about. This book is about adaptations and transformations of buildings, architectural transformations, additive architecture. The term that I will not use is adaptive reuse, because it really is a program-based term. And it's a term that was invented in the second half of the 20th century, and it seems to imply, as it is born in the 20th century, it seems to imply that the idea of reusing building, either for the same use or for a different use, is a modern idea. It's not a modern idea, it's a very old idea, and it has a very, very deep and complex and rich history. And it's not only an history of survival for the buildings and the people who survive through them, it's also a history of inventions through the necessity to reuse something. So a lot of formal inventions, if you look at history through this lens that I'm looking at now, if you look at history through this lens, meaning looking to privilege buildings over time with multiple authors and sort of the definition of the outlines of the project not limited to the building itself, then history changes, and that's what's very interesting. So to just formalize the list, I'm going to quickly go through it. This is about looking at buildings over time and redefining the author and finding that buildings have multiple authors over time. It's also about discovering the creative potential of architectural transformations and their fundamental role in the history of architecture in order to instruct a more complete architectural history. This is also about redefining the new. The new doesn't have to look new to be new. We have this idea that the new has to look abstract and different, but it's not always the case. And this is also about tapping into the environmental wisdom and creative possibilities of using and reusing existing buildings. And in the end, it is about coming to terms with and valuing open-ended work, which accepts future authors. This is about the value of the incomplete. So with that as a preamble, I want to ask a question. What do these two buildings have in common? I'm sure there's many answers, but there's a particular answer. So anybody has an idea? Somebody has raised his hand, yes? No. Don't be shy. Well, these two buildings, what they have in common is that they are both not new buildings. They are both additions to an earlier buildings, and they are both icons of the particular period in which they operate. On the left is the Basilica in Vicenza, the Palazzo della Ragione, the Palace of Reason, which is a law court, by Andrea Palladio in 1549, started in 1549, which is, in my taxonomy, a wrap. It's a Renaissance wrap around a late Gothic building, which was the courts. And the building on the right is La Maison de Verre in Paris, 1928, by Pierre Charot. And that is an insertion under an 18th century building because the people above did not want to sell. So these two buildings and these two buildings that are, standard bearers for a certain period are in fact not new buildings, they're additions. And that is an interesting thing to consider. So now what we're going to look, the book has about 30 buildings and sites. They're not all buildings, some of them are urban sites. Some of them are very big, some of them are very small. So I can only, show you just a very small sample of that, but we're going to go through chronologically, all the chapters. So we're going to start with, in the 5th and 6th century, with the reuse of Roman ruins for urban uses. Then we'll go in the early Renaissance and look at what I call an urban renewal project in Florence, and that's the Uffizi. Then in England, to look at an extraordinary building, which is very complicated to understand, but very interesting as a different way to design. Then in the 19th century, we see the emergence of new urban forms, Haussmann's Paris, for example, and Regent Street and Regent Park in London, and we'll look at London. And then in the modern era, we will look at the Barcelona Pavilion by Mies van der Rohe, which is admittedly a provocation in this whole list, and we'll talk about it some more. And then the Alte Pinakothek in Munich after the Second World War. And we'll end in New York with the, oops, sorry, I pushed the wrong button. We'll end Yeah. The light is at the top, yes. Yes. So we'll end in New York with the addition to the Pepsi Cola headquarters and a very small building on Duane Street, which is right now added to right now as we speak. So to start with the 5th and 6th century, in the 5th century, as the Roman Empire was collapsing, the situation in Italy and in the Roman colonies, France, Germany, was becoming extremely unstable, and people took refuge in the large established structures, which were the Roman amphitheaters. Rome had built these amphitheaters in the 1st century AD to host spectacular sports, gladiator sports, animal fights, and the like. And they built them outside the cities in general, and often in combination with the theater. And the Romans being Romans, all these theaters are the same size. They're all accommodated by 20,000 spectators. So it's an interesting sort of systematic approach. Anyway, in the 5th and 6th century, people took refuge in these structures to protect themselves from invaders and from just, local insecurity. So we're going to look at 3 amphitheaters that were reclaimed in the 5th and 6th century in the way which I described, but which over time until now have been reclaimed in different ways. So that there's a history to those things. These are vernacular, there are many authors to this work, but it is interesting that it has some commonality. So the first we're going to look at is in Arles, which is in the south of France. And you see the picture, oh, I'm doing this again. Yes. So the picture on the left is a woodcut of what happened. So what happened is the perimeter of this amphitheater, which you see in plan here as restored. So this is where people would sit. And there's these galleries there. So these structural walls, which are radial, they go to the centers of the ellipses. These became bearing walls, and people filled in the arches, the open arches, and they constructed themselves houses in there. So this whole perimeter of these buildings became multiple housing. Then some churches were built here and some defense towers. And then inside the sort of performance space, the city expanded, this little city expanded inside, and they built houses the way they knew how to build them because they were built de novo, so they didn't have the supporting walls. So this is a very contained little city. And then at some point, and they all have this characteristic, which is very interesting, at some point when the situation became a little safer, they expanded outside. So typically you see the expansion outside, and what happens is that they build outside to meet a regional road or a local road. So this is probably facing a street. So in the case of Arles, in the first half of the 19th century, the state decided that they would restore this amphitheater to its original condition. So it has been restored to its original condition, which is, you can see this in plan. This is a Google view, and this is a case where the Romans had built a theater next to it. So this now has been restored. They kept some defensive towers, and it's partly in ruin and partly restored. So this was the destiny of this thing. In Florence, though, it's a very different story. I mean, it's the same story at the beginning, which is in the 5th and 6th century, people just retreated in this building. And you can almost not see it. In a Google view, it's here. This is Piazza San Croce, this is San Croce. And so this is, and you see, it has remained colonized, so to speak. So you see here a plan. So you see here a plan, and you see that when the situation became a little more secure, the villagers, so to speak, expanded to meet the Via dei Benci. But the plan is really interesting to look at, because in the perimeter, the structural walls were constantly used. But when they got into the middle of the performance space, then the Florentines did what they know how to do, which is to build courtyard housing. So this is a courtyard, this is a courtyard. So although the geometry is affected by the sort of radial quality of these walls, the building topology inside changes. But I find it really interesting that, you know, between Lucca and Florence, and I'm sure these people were not talking to each other, this strategy of expanding outside the walls here, expanding outside the walls to meet a regional street is really interesting. And the view of this juncture here is here. So this is a new palazzo that's built, and this is a connection to the perimeter of the building. And the last example in this series is in Lucca, in Italy, which is a hybrid solution. So in Lucca, again, they had that completely colonized inside. This is a drawing in the early 19th century, 1830. This is 1830 plan, which is actually based on 1819 drawing. So early in the 19th century, you know, a new consciousness emerged about the value of old buildings, and certainly Roman ruins were certainly valued. So this engineer did a drawing that is beautiful because it's an analytical drawing. It represents what is and what is to remain in black. And then it represents what is and is to be demolished in a lighter tone. So it looks like there was a big plaza here, and then there were buildings here, and all these buildings have been demolished. So this is a hybrid solution between total restoration and total colonization. So this is the condition of the building now, where this plaza is visible. And people talked at the time about freeing the building and making it, you know, be itself again. So next we're going to go to Florence, and this is a early 20th century picture on the left of the Uffizi by Giorgio Vasari. And I love this picture because it tells a very interesting political and social story. What you see as a focus of the picture is the Palazzo Vecchio, which is a residence of the Medici. And it's a fortress. It's a much older building. And it represents a time in the city where the power rests with the Lord or with the church. So that's the seat of power. But then we have, coming towards us in front of it, we have the Uffizi, which Cosimo built, and Giorgio Vasari was the architect. And the Uffizi represent a different view of the administration of the city. It's the city is changing from a economic, mercantile entity to a political and administrative entity. And the difference between these two kinds of architecture is very telling in that transition. So what we're seeing, but what is fascinating to me about the design of the Uffizi is that while it seems to be irregular, it actually is able to accommodate a tremendous amount of circumstantial irregularity. So I don't know if you can see on this picture, but there's a very regular deployment of you know, arches and columns. It's very, very good. But here, if you can see, it changes. The arcade that exists here, you'll see them in a bit, disappears because this is the Mint. And in the city of bankers, you don't mess around with the Mint. So the Mint was incorporated in the design of this irregularity of the Mint was incorporated in the design of this very regular thing. And of course, this is the aerial view. So this is the Uffizi. This is the Palazzo Vecchio. And then the Zecca, the Mint, is here. And a story, of course, gets very interesting and complicated because there's the Vasari corridor, which goes from Palazzo Vecchio over this bridge, over this wing, goes here, goes into a stair, goes into this arcade, goes over the bridge, and then goes through buildings, churches, and re-emerges in the Palazzo Pitti. So this is both a surgical insertion in the Uffizi, are both a surgical insertion into a medieval fabric, but they also become a very extended sort of infrastructural entity in the city of Florence. So you see here the regularity of this design by Vasari, which consists of a triple bay and then a solid sort of side to the bay. So it's a repetition of this triple bay, which you were seeing in the picture. And this is the ground floor plan. So this gets deployed here and it gets deployed here, but at the Mint, it stops. And what I find really to be a lesson for modern architects, because modern architects are not very good at accommodating incident. We try to make everything really neat and regular and legible, and it gets a bit boring. So what is interesting about this whole operation is that you recognize the design of the Uffizi here. You know what it is, and you know that it's new. But at the back, it's very frayed. You know, the back accommodates all this. So there is no facade, in a way, for this new building. This only facade is this. And I think it's an important urban lesson to learn for us, because we find it very hard to have our buildings unrecognizable. And I think that's a very interesting aspect of this building. And then there is, so you see this regularity here in the photograph on the left, and then the loggia towards the Arno, which is a variation on the regular modules, but is a little bit different. And then there's the corridor that goes to the Palazzo Pitti, which was meant as an escape corridor in times of urban trouble. I think the Medici were more afraid of the Florentine than they were afraid of the Sienese, for example. So this, and I call this an urban renewal project because I think it's useful for us to remember that there's other ways to do urban renewal than the way we've done in the 20th century. And this has been vastly more successful than our urban renewal projects in the 20th century. So now we're going to look at a project that is, I'm afraid, really, really hard to understand, but I think we'll try. So sometimes this is a case where change and really massive change is hidden in plain sight. Because when you look at this building, you think it was designed at one single period by one single person, and nothing could be further from the truth. This is a building that was built, and it was demolished and rebuilt, and it is dizzying. So the original appearance of the building was on the left. So this building here, which you were looking at from the other side, this is that building. And it was built when Henry VIII parted ways with the Vatican. All the monasteries were taken over by the crown. And he, in what you could term a vast real estate operation, and he gave a particular monastery, which was particularly wonderful, to his chancellor who had organized that whole operation. So the building that you saw in the first slide, was built on the foundation of the earlier monastery. So the size of the courtyard of the building is actually the size of the cloister of the monastery. So there's a kind of layering of things. So this was built as a great prodigy house, which was meant to host the great progresses of the court, which they were doing every year to sort of visit their possessions. And so they built on this on these foundations, and then they built a massive front courtyard here. And Queen Elizabeth was there once, and King James was there once, I think. But by then the family had completely ruined itself and could not keep up the building. So they started demolishing it. So they demolished, I'll show you the slide. They demolished this, they demolished this wing eventually, they demolished some ends. They keep demolishing the building. And so what we have now is, and this is in the same direction as this, so this still remains, these ends still remain, but this whole back has disappeared, and these back wings have been cut in half. They used to be much longer. And this happens over the years. This happens over the years with different owners who keep redesigning the building, but redesigning it in the Jacobean style in which it was first built. So they maintain this style over the centuries. So this is, I don't expect you to understand it, it's taken me a long time. So this is the original condition of the building, and then they demolished the sides of this, and then they cut down these wings. So they have to, because they cut down these wings, this is a ruin, so they have to redesign this. Then they cut them down further. Then they rebuild them, and they're rebuilt. But what you have to remember is that through these 4 centuries, because the first phase is 1605, and the last really significant phase is really in the 19th century. So it's 2 or 3 centuries through which this operation happens, and people keep reviving the building in its old style, but it's a new construction. So this sort of persistence of dynastic ambition, you could call it, is quite fascinating. So the warm color are old. Sorry, my apology. The warm colors are older, and the cool colors are younger. This is a gallery that was built by Robert Adam in the 18th century. So now you see a building that, even though it is executed in this Jacobean style, it is in the middle of a romantic classical park designed by Capability Brown, with a little Tempietto here, and a beautiful tea house bridge by Robert Adam of 1783. So the relationship of the building to the landscape is very, very different than its relationship to the land when it was built, in a cloister form. So the evolution. So when I said the modifications are hidden in plain sight, they are really profound. This is not a cloister building anymore. This is not a fortress anymore. This is a building that's open to the landscape, the way a classical building would be, and it's surrounded by these romantic eye catchers in the landscape. So the relationship, the way the building presents itself is in a way twofold. It's still a Tudor building, it's still a Jacobean building, excuse me, but it really has a classical dimension which has been added over time. And those things are profound. There are new ideas that are layered onto the building, added by multiple authors. And lastly, this is one of the rebuilt wings here, with these inimitable vernacular English Tudor windows. And in 1825, they took the Great Hall and made it more Jacobean than it was by hanging banner and giving it all this sort of military regalia. So there's this persistence of dynastic expression realized through the centuries in both in a Jacobean dress, but also in a classical environment. So in the late 18th and 19th century, a new urban form emerged, In Paris. It was invented in Paris, but it developed very, very quickly, and it very quickly it spread throughout all of Europe, and quickly crossed the Atlantic and was realized as new buildings in the United States. So this is passage couvert, covered passages, and they are privately owned public spaces. We talk about this all the time. They're privately owned passages that connect two very busy commercial streets. And these were initiatives of private landowners, private real estate, private owners of buildings that were trying to monetize their buildings, maximize the use of their building. And they cut through the blocks and they cut through the buildings. And the design of these passages is very consistent. The shop fronts are oops, I do it again. I'm sorry. Yes. The shop front design is very consistent, and they're always lit by zenithal lighting through skylights. So in general, a floor and a half. I mean, there's a sort of shortened floor above, it's called in French entresol. But you see the repetition of the columns. The design is very consistent, and in those years, it must have seemed miraculous because at this time, Paris didn't have sidewalks, there was no public lighting. So they were safe, they were protected from the weather, they became lit, they became the first examples of public lighting. So it's quite a thing. And this is a plan. So you see, the first passage is the Passage des Panoramas. And it's called panoramas, because the panoramas, some of you may know, were these circular buildings inside which were painted, landscapes or scenes of battles or things, Naples and Tivoli and all these things. And I think the Metropolitan Museum used to have one. I don't know if it's still exhibited. And it was quite the rage, and it was invented by Robert Fulton, and he owned the idea. And it was built, so this is the panorama here. And it was the rage, and it attracted a lot of people, and there was a theater here as well. And so the owner of this hotel decided to monetize the passage from a street to another. And he built this coordinated design passage, and then these shops are all along it. And in a way, you can see, I'm sure they had no idea about what Vasari had done in Florence, but it's the same idea. It's the idea of a coordinated, legible interior and a lack of concern for the edges. And so this is a building that has only one interior form and no exterior form. And later on, these passages, this is the same site. Later on, so this is the original passage, and you can still see the theaters here. Later on, it expanded across the street and across the other street, and it branched out to the side. So it becomes a complete sort of infrastructure. And in Paris, there are a lot of these passages, and there's a lot of them all over Europe. It was a very successful invention. On the left is a view of the first passage, the Passage des Panoramas, and you can see, the story and a half. You can see the zenithal lighting, and you can see a very busy social life. The first passage was really inspired by something that had been done in the Palais Royal, which was maybe less formal, and built in the 1780s, just before the Revolution. And it was built on a courtyard of a palace that was owned of housing that was owned by the brother of the king. And because he was the brother of the king, he enjoyed advantages that other people didn't have. And one of the advantages is that the police could not come onto the site. So it was a very lively site of social life, social interactions, ladies of the night, political harangues, and so there's always been a connection between these covered passages and entertainment, and a occasionally slightly illicit set of things. You see here again this coordinated design and the people enjoying shopping. This is also at the time when there's a new sort of a new way of living in the city. On the left is a Passage Verdot, which is an expansion of that first passage. And then very quickly, in 1816, 1818, the first passage is built in London, designed by John Nash, in a very suave Regency style. And it does have public lighting, and it does have the skylight, and it does have this coordinated design for the shop, and then again. That you can see here. And this too is a private space, which is publicly used. And these spaces are all still private spaces, publicly used. And then it crosses the ocean, and here you have in Providence in 1828. So very, very quickly it crosses the ocean. And this is a building completely built as a new building. And in the States, it's built as new buildings. And of course, we know the modern iteration of this building form, and it's the suburban mall, which is built as a new building in a sea of parking, excuse me. So it's quite an interesting evolution. But all of this was born out of a need to make do with something that exists, to densify it, to monetize it, to just use it more. But something new came out of it, which I think is what happens with a lot of these building adaptation. I hope that's a lesson that you will take away. Now, this is not a building, this is a large urban intervention. This is Regent's Park and Regent Street. Like Napoleon's the third work by Haussmann in Paris, it sort of reconfigures the city, and like Napoleon's interventions in Paris, and like the Vasari, Uffizi, it's visible as a form from one view, but at the back, it's invisible as a project in a way. So that is true. This is what's called a quadrant. Where the street makes a turn, but it's true over the whole length of Regent Street, where you're aware of the street on the street, but the back is very frayed. So this is really an extraordinary project because it starts with the fact that Marylebone Park, which is here, which was and is owned by the Crown. The lease was coming to an end, and the Regent's administration thought it was the ideal time to reconsider how to redevelop this estate, maybe get more money out of it. So John Nash, the Regent's architect, started sort of thinking about it, and so the Marylebone Park, that was the name. Nash renamed it Marylebone Park, but it was actually named Marylebone Park. Nash develops there the idea of a sort of an in-town ideal suburb, an in-town thing that would have a lot of different things. It had factories, it had sort of monumental housing, which you'll see. It had a canal, which still exists, which is Regent's Canal. And it had, as I said, very monumental housing, almost at a Roman grandeur kind of scale. But it also had these little toy villas designed on Tuscan countryside memories. And so this was that. And then came the idea of joining this to the Regent's residence, which was at Carlton House. And so the Regent would take this, metaphorical promenade from the city, literally, to, this is a quadrant which you just saw, to the country, and then arrive in this ideal suburb. It's quite a construction, and because he couldn't cut a straight, cut through the city, Nash develops this picturesque design, which is partly the result of some streets existing and the need to connect them with other streets, partly the result of expropriations, but it takes major picturesque advantage of these accidents, and it's a very fascinating project. So this is a quadrant, which was the first picture you saw, as designed by Nash, but it itself has been changed in the early 20th century and monumentalized. The porches were eliminated early on because they were the sites of some questionable activities, and the shopkeepers complained that they were too dark. So the quadrant has been redesigned as a facade. So it has evolved over the years. But I want to show you an interesting point, which is where Regent Street turns into Langham Place and then to Portland Place. Now, what's interesting is that Portland Place existed. It's a wide residential street, and it was designed by the Adam brothers in the 18th century. So it was pre-existing. It has these patrician houses, and I suppose that Nash couldn't expropriate them, and he kept them. But then the problem was that here was Regent Street coming, and there was a property in a way, and so he bought this property and demolished the center mansion. But what's to me really a valuable lesson is that he kept, the things that are in light pink are buildings which are kept. These buildings still exist, this building still exists. And he just lined the street with very narrow, very shallow buildings, and then used All Souls Church, which he designed, as a pivot for the turn of the street. So the lesson is that demolish as little as you can and use all the accidents that you can to your advantage. And he certainly did. So this is the termination of Regent Street through Portland Place. This is Portland Place, into this monumental, almost Roman scale housing. But the whole estate has also these little buildings. So the whole architectural palette is in part about consistency, but in part about the accident, and also again, the backs, as in the Vasari project for the Uffizi, the back is frayed. It's like the back is allowed to do what it needs to do to meet the city. Now to the Barcelona Pavilion. This was built in 1928 for a fair in Barcelona, and actually very few people saw it. Only the people who went to the fair, in reality, only the people who went to the fair, and it was not up for more than a year. It was up for less than a year. So this is the money shot. This is a photograph that everybody knows. You can see this pavilion by Mies van der Rohe and Lily Reich in all its abstracted glory, because solid, simple planes of this is marble in this case, very, very simple form, very geometric, sort of floating, very horizontal, and there's the palace here. What's interesting is that Mies had been given another site in this fair. The plan of the fair was a grand Beaux-Arts affair with axes and plazas and avenues and the whole sort of vocabulary of Beaux-Arts planning, and he had been given another site, and he chose this one because that was the site he wanted. So we know the pavilion, but when you look at the picture, something else is happening. And that something else that's happening is this. The shadow of these columns, freestanding columns that were in front of the building. And this is about, understanding the limits of the work. People think that the work is just this building, but the work is not just this building, because the work is the building and its context, which means captured and made serve to the advantage of his work. So this is a picture of an aerial picture of the work as during the fair. So this is this abstract pavilion, and then you have these classical columns and these pylons, which act as a filter for people coming through to it. So you're coming from the main access here, and you're coming through this filter on access, and then you have to make a right, and you have to go through this little stair, and have to miss this screen, have to go, and then you go through this stair, which was existing. You go through this stair to go further up to the palace, which is on the left. Now, this is what architects call a promenade architecturale, an architectural promenade, meaning the architect designs a way for the viewer or the user of the building to experience the building in different ways, which are pre-planned. And these two drawings are really interesting, because the drawing on the left is by Mies van der Rohe himself, and it's in the archive of the Museum of Modern Art. And what's interesting about this drawing is that it shows the greenery around this little squiggly line is the greenery around the building. It shows the greenery around the building here, and it shows the existing stair here. So Mies took this in his design. It was conscious and it was part of the design. But when the building is publicized as part of this propaganda, effort for the modern movement, when the building is publicized in the publication by Philip Johnson for the Museum of Modern Art, it becomes a free exercise on a blank sheet of paper. It has no context whatsoever. This stair has disappeared. The greenery has disappeared. It's all about the building. So that is in a way devastating, because it's denying the elements of the design that Mies had used to make his design valuable, because this was on the part of Mies van der Rohe. This was a manifesto for modern architecture. This was in opposition to the old, tired, old formal world of the Beaux-Arts architecture. And what better place to be than in a grand Beaux-Arts plan with all these Beaux-Arts things around, including the columns. And so if you eliminate all of that, you deprive this building of its revolutionary force, and it's a profound misunderstanding of it. And so why is it important to analyze buildings in a more complete way than we tend to do it? It's important because when this building was rebuilt in the 80s, and this is it, it's rebuilt without the columns. And when you see it, if any one of you have seen it, it is profoundly disappointing, because it just is missing all this processional aspect to it. So you cannot say the building has been restored. It's been rebuilt, yes, as a building, but it's really lacking, in my view, of the elements that made it what it was. So this is in a chapter I call Reclamation of Urban Fragments Post-World War II, and it's the Alter Pinakothek in Munich by Hans Dolgast, 1952, 1957. I own knowing this building to my friend Harry Kendall. Thank you. Who is here. So this is a beautiful museum designed by Leo van Clance in the 19th century. But what happened? Look at the middle. What did happen? What did happen is that to this ordered you know, classical revival buildings with repetitive arches, you know, a center porch, these skylights over the exhibition rooms, is that in 1945, a couple of bombs fell in the middle of the building that sort of cut it in two, cut out the roof practically. So this happened in 1945, and the picture is from 1946. This happened in 1945, and quickly after that, the architect Hans Dolger started working on what to do with this building. And in 1952, he was hired to bring it back into service. There was a fierce battle in 1950 before the commission was given to him. There was a fierce battle between people who thought that the building should be restored and put back into service, and people that said, we're in the modern times, we need a building of our own age, we need to build a modern building. But eventually, they decided to handle this building. And I'm not using the word restore because it's too simple. So Dolgast, who had been working on this by then for a few years, I mean, it's amazing to think that I think in 46 or 47, he was already working on it. So the old building, so this is sort of a plan of the old building. The old building was, in a way, as an eye with two bars at the end. It had a series of center exhibition rooms, each one with its own skylight, organized along the idea of, you know, styles, schools of painting. And then on the north, it had a series of smaller cabinets with north light for drawings and more fragile items. And then on the south, it had a huge loggia. These stairs did not exist, a huge loggia to give a view of the city. And the main entrance of the building was here on the east. Dolgast changes that organization and locates the entrance at the place of the bomb, at the place of major damage. He decides to incorporate the history of this disaster into the remaking of the building. And he decides that this is what's going to be the sort of the visual center of the building. So he moves the entrance to here, and then if you can see this faint drawing, he constantly works at exposing these gas. Originally, this is an early photograph of the south facade. Originally, he wanted to leave it completely open, and so you would enter this way, and then you would see the various layers of demolition. These are new columns to support the roof. But eventually, the museum wanted him to close it, so he closed it, but with an abstracted. He never wanted to restore von Klenz's design. The von Klenz design is left as is. When he brings back the wall, he brings back the visual structure of the windows and the visual rhythm of these bays, but in an abstracted way, and he builds it in brick. This is actually reclaimed brick from a nearby caserna. So, and it creates moments of really extraordinary interest as these two things meet. And he decides to do away with the sort of pyramid skylights that von Klenz had done for a very sort of minimal and trim and linear set of skylights. So these are steel columns to support the new cornice, which are again abstracted. And when you're there, it is a very, very beautiful thing to see. It's both painful and beautiful, and you're aware of passage of time, and it is quite a wonderful thing. This is our penultimate building. This is the addition to the Pepsi Cola headquarters. This is the addition. The Pepsi Cola headquarters was designed by Gordon Bunshaft with Nathalie Deblois of Skidmore, Winks and Merrill in the 60s. And it was designed as a very ideal object in a way like Mises' Pavilion, in opposition to the dark city. You see its relationship with the existing building here. So there was a separation here that separated it. It's floating over the ground. So it's this aloof, beautiful, complete object like Bramante's San Pietro in a way. And in the 80s, it was not landmarked. It was contemplated to be demolished for an addition, but eventually some complicated land deal happened, and James Stewart Polchek designed, and partners designed an addition to this building. And it is extremely successful. It uses the language of the original building, which is modern, sort of abstract, but mixes it with a sort of more postmodern expression of this dark tower here. We'll look at it in a second. So here's the building. Here's the building on the left, the original building on the left, with its reveal that separates it from the old building, and then it's floating on the ground. So it's a very very beautiful and soft and ideal building, but this is not a new strategy. You know, these one of the things that the book is trying to get us to understand is that beyond the surface of style and architectural expression and architectural manners that change over time, there are recurring schemes, there are recurring patterns of how to deal with a certain situation. And so basically, the Pepsi Color addition is the problem of a very large addition to a very small building. And so it was for the addition to the Custom House in Boston. This is a very large addition to a very, very small building. And the strategy is the same. These Peabody and Stearns used the language of the original building, which is classical revival, in this case, Greek revival, but they're more Roman than Greek. But they recompose the building so that it becomes a coherent entity as recomposed. And this is exactly what Polchek does. They recompose this building so it becomes a coherent entity. This building was aloof from the city, but this building now was described by the architects as joining, the context of Midtown towers. So it gets transformed in the doing, but as a formal entity, it still works. And it works through a lot of tricks. I mean, this is the same language as this, but it's in a much smaller scale, so it seems to be further back. This dark sort of tower onto which this is anchored is dark granite, which is matte. It has this regular pattern of windows. There's no hierarchy in those buildings. So it's, the art of composition is in full tilt there. So, and it's quite a successful thing. And you see this idea on the left with this, which seems to be related to this, but it's really a new building. And this, which disappears at the back. And so the idea is to build this dark tower, which is this granite tower, and then to clamp on it these kind of bay windows, which become visible while the tower is kind of disappears. So this fantastically modern building that Bunshaft and de Blois had done, which was separate from the city, now is described by the new architects as having joined the city. So it's an interesting twist. And finally, we will end on a small building in Duane Street to remind all of us architects that you should be ambitious even with a small building. This is on Duane Street, on Duane Park. It's not being added to as we speak, so it's going to change again. But this was a warehouse, and the area was not designated as a landmark district. And the architect Paul Sinelli decided to save the cast iron facade, and then to inside insert a modern building. So you can see here this very neutral grid of glass blocks, And again, this is a concept. This is an insertion of a new thing inside an old thing. And this is quite, again, a beautiful building. This is not a new idea. I mean, this is a reverse idea from the Basilica in Vicenza. And this idea had been tested by Mitchell Jugerla in Philadelphia a few years before 1970. In my view, a less successful iteration. So this is the building. So this is the building. These are the headquarters of a savings bank. So this is an old building in addition to it, and this is the Mitchell Jugerla addition. And here was Egyptian revival building by John Haviland of 1838, which actually looks like is old from 1838, but it was actually Haviland's half is this, and in 1920 somebody added this other half, so this already is an addition. But anyways, Mitchell Jugerla decided they could not demolish the building, and they decided to save the facade and turn it into a screen, which is conceptually an interesting idea, but as executed, it has some problems. But it has some problems because through these lovely windows, you see, grid fluorescent lighting of the office building behind, and it's a little miserable. So this is, and this works better because Pulcinelli was able to do a very, very neutral background to this. So this is allowed to be, the preeminent thing that you see. And now for our last image, looking back to look forwards, I want to present you with a quote by Leone Battista Alberti in 1454. I'm going to say it in Italian because I can't resist it. E volsi aiutare quel che fatto e non guastare quello che s'abbia fare. And one wants to help what has been done and not to spoil what one has yet to do. So Alberti is, and this is when he was working on the Tempio Martestiano, in which he sort of wrapped a new facade around a late Gothic building, that he's already asserting the architect's responsibility to the past and to the future, and the fact that the architect has to be mindful of both. So this couldn't be a greater, in my view, statement of architectural responsibility to the built world. So thank you very much. And if you have questions, I'm happy to try to answer.
Yes, Francois, and bear with me, I'm new at this because we all know Karen does it the best. So Karen, we miss you and we know you're online. So Francois, that was fascinating. I know that, I won't be looking at buildings all over town and thinking, I think many of us here thought about historic preservation and conservation as 20th century terms. But I just want to say that and it helps me when I introduce people to our building, because this is an extension. The building was built in 1890. This extension was built in 1903. And if you go upstairs or look upstairs, you can see that those windows were conserved. There's a door that tilts and it's a window. And I always say that the General Society was conducting historic preservation before it was a term. And this whole extension explains all of that. And the doorways, everything was a window upstairs. So when you go up to the Mossman Lock collection, please have a look. And sometimes that window has come in handy when I've been locked out of the office, but so, and we will take questions, but as Karen would do, she would enthusiastically hold up this book and say, and this wonderful book is for sale, and afterwards. And I was reading about the generously illustrated with architectural plans and 300 color images. And I looked at the book and it's so, enjoyable to read through. You've organized it beautifully. So you'll be signing copies afterwards Françoise, so thank you.
Sure.
And we'll just take, does the audience have any questions?
Be courageous.
Okay.
There's somebody behind you, you'll be second.
That was fascinating watching these buildings transform into their needs at that time. So my question to you is, do architects now, when they are designing buildings, consider it, do they consider the structure of it so that it can be transformed by other architects that will come generations after them? Is that in something that people are trained in, or is it just you deal with it when you cross that bridge? Thank
That's
you.
a really interesting question. I mean, I know there's architects in the audience, so you're welcome to disagree with me. I think that. Sorry. Oh, that is not something we're trying to do. But I think that is definitely not something we're trying to do. And that is by and large not something we think about, which is really too bad. But I think maybe I hope the time for this idea has come because of the environmental crisis in which we find ourselves. So I think people try to talk about that, the idea of reusing buildings, but in fact, they don't, because we've just demolished Hotel Pennsylvania, we just demolished 270 Park Avenue, we demolished things. And I mean, so I think that we haven't quite realized how bad it is. But no, in answer to your question, I'm an architect. This is not something we were trained to do. And I think in the culture of architecture, even now, and I'm not talking about the culture of historic preservation, there is a desire to do new buildings. And buildings are totally new. So, and that's a problem. So this person was second, and how are you, sir?
Kind of following what you just said about the climate crisis, I'm wondering what you see. Is there a space, is there an opening for architects to redesign, modify buildings to make them more environmentally friendly?
That's happening all the time, and it's a very contested problem because it's in a way it's not just involved with making buildings more efficient, it's also involved with repositioning, as people say in real estate, repositioning a building. There's a building on Vesey Street, which some of you in the room probably know, which is a perfectly serviceable, former telephone building with a perfectly serviceable brick wall, and it's been reskinned, with a curtain glass, a curtain wall of glass. And so we're putting a dumpster, perfectly recyclable bricks, and we're replacing them with non-recyclable glass, because modern glass is not recyclable because of the coatings. So there's a whole industry that is reskinning buildings to reposition them environmentally. The balance sheet is really hard to establish because you're throwing away all this embodied energy, like we've spent carbon, getting the stuff out of the ground, building the building. We have it, it's for free. We throw that out because we say, oh, we're gonna have a more efficient exterior wall. So you've lost like tons and tons of CO2, and then you're spending tons and tons of new CO2, and this efficiency, you're not going to realize it for another, the balance sheet is not going to even out for another 20 years. So yes, in answer to you, these things are being done, but they're not necessarily being done, in my view, they're not necessarily being done to sort of say, oh, well, there's this old building, we could do something better with it, and they're really being done for real estate reasons, and it's not always that good. Harry?
And I just want to add to that about energy efficiency. For example, this particular building, we have received an A rating.
Yes,
And,
right.
but it's the original system. So there's so many things that they had right then. I'd like to think of people who have come before us as they thought of everything. They really did, even in design, you know? And with our, you know, I know everybody says electricity and these newer split units. We have 103 radiators that were installed between 1890 and 1903, and we still have the same radiators. They don't become obsolete parts some 25 years later and go into a landfill. And these walls have, they're very energy efficient in cooling, and it's just amazing what was designed. And some of these LEED buildings now, they have, because I have to look at letters, so I see Fs, but I'd like to call attention to our A. We worked for that A. So we also have the world's expert in steam heating and hydronics, so it's important to make the right friends, of course.
So I think there was a question from the gentleman here.
Thank you. I love the way the first question seemed to pivot everything toward discussion of climate change and sustainability. And you said there's architects in the audience that might want to add to the first question about how architects, are they trained, or are architects today designing buildings? I think one of the less discussed principles of sustainability, but one of the original series of talking points was the phrase long life, loose fit.
Right.
Which really does argue for buildings that will evolve as time goes on. And of course, there are many architects who are revered, but designed incredibly obdurate buildings, like Paul Rudolph, for example, that have proved challenging to adapt. But I do think lying behind your book is a different ethos that suits the modern era of awareness of the need for sustainability very well.
Thank you.
So that wasn't a question, but
It's okay. I take it.
It was meant to get around to praise for your book, which I really admire.
Thank you very much.
We'll just take these two more questions, if no one minds, from our online audience. And John asked, how could the Barcelona Pavilion be rebuilt after so many years? Were its parts put in storage, and was it dismantled in 1928?
I don't know the complete answer to this question. What I know is that they were not able to find the exact marble that was in the original pavilion. I suspect that it wasn't dismantled and saved in storage, but I don't know it absolutely for a fact. I mean, just as a segue to this question, I think it's very, very, very hard to rebuild something when the architect isn't there anymore. And I think one of the examples in my mind is the Roosevelt Memorial in Roosevelt Island, which I don't know whether Luke Kahn would have made the same decisions.
Okay, all right, thank you. And just two more questions. Thank you for your wonderful presentation. Do you have an opinion about the hybrid restorations that have been constructed in the meatpacking district? And that's Jacqueline.
Oh, I think there's a lot of wonderful stuff in the meatpacking district, and it can take it somehow. I mean, I think, you know, the Porter House, for example, is, I change opinion about it, you know, like every fortnight, but it's an interesting building, and so there's a lot of buildings, you know, in between. Some of them are better than others, but it's a lively architectural scene. And I think there's a whole new block that's been rebuilt that I just like very much as well. So I think it has been a really interesting field for architectural experimentation. And I think by and large, I mean, in the historic districts in New York City, there's a lot of interesting stuff that has been done in Soho as well. There's a lot of, so the districts, I mean, they're managed both by the Landmarks Commission and by the advocates and by the people around. And so this push and pull that you get in historic districts is really gets the work to be better. And so, and the meatpacking district is kind of the same in that way.
All right, thank you. And though we have 2 questions, we'll be getting to, even though she's anonymous, we're going to put her question over. Abby, we won't forget you. I'll make sure your question, because it's a 3-part question, gets to you. And so this is from anonymous. Are you excited or pessimistic about the state of building adaptations today, especially as more office towers are sitting vacant in downtowns?
Well, I think, you know, it's not because something changes that it's bad. And so if you think about the whole Wall Street area and the amount of residential renovations, residential sort of transformations of these office buildings, it has been by and large a success story. I'm waiting for the Class B office buildings renovation into housing to be a success story. I think that should be very interesting. I mean, I'm going to provoke a small revolt here. My bottom line is do not demolish anything. Because if you demolish anything, it means that you're just not talented enough to be able to deal with it. So you should be able to deal with something that exists and have a new idea. So I'm excited by the possibilities in answer to this question. I just regret that a lot of decisions are made with just the bottom line in mind, and that this bottom line is very demanding. If you remember at the beginning of the century, the Astors and mostly the Astors were building social housing, and their motto was philanthropy plus 3%. So for them, a 3% profit was good enough, but it's not good enough for any investor now. You know, so I think the problem is you know how those decisions are made. I think there's a lot of interesting work to be done with this Class B dome curtain wall office building, and there's a lot of good ideas to be had about that.
Yes, and speaking of which, for anyone here who's from the Landmarks Conservancy, and for our dear friend Peg Breen, who's calling attention to what's going to happen around Penn Station.
Yes, it's
right. I mean, and talk about demolishing buildings. So please keep your eye on Peg Breen's emails. That's a project that shouldn't go forward in its present state. So
the demolition of the Pennsylvania Hotel is really dumb.
Yeah, and Madison Square Garden and all of that.
Yeah.
But so may the people win. So Françoise, thank you so much. You're always so generous to us with your lectures, but also you keep in touch, and we really appreciate that. So, and you'll come back again, I do hope. And here is your commemorative poster for your project. And I'd like to remind everyone, so I can make Karen proud, that this book is for sale. And Françoise will be signing copies in the back. So thank you. Thank you to our in-person audience. Thank you for our online audience. And please, to our in-person audience, please join us for a glass of wine. So thank you.
Thank you.